Welcome. Welcome to Good News from St. Andrews, Guelph. I'm your host, the Reverend John Borthwick, and it is a delight to be with you again today. This Sunday at St. Andrews in Guelph, the Sunday past, was our anniversary service, and we celebrated 193 years of being a congregation in the city of Guelph. That's quite something to be around that long. We've been around as long as, within a few months, really, of the city of Guelph being established. And I wanted to share a couple of interesting things with you today. I've got our history book that was written by the Reverend Dr. Stanford Reed, who was a member of this church and was at the University of Guelph for quite some time, and certainly a prestigious scholar and a learned individual. I have a history degree. Let me just preface some of what I'm about to say today by saying I have a love and a deep appreciation of history. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk a little bit about how one celebrates an anniversary in the context that we're currently living in. And so I wanted to read a couple of quotes from A Century and a Half of Witness, 1828 to 1978, the story of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Guelph, from Dr. Stanford Reed. This is how he starts out this history book. The story of the founding of Guelph has been told many times, so it's not necessary to repeat it. But what is often forgotten is that settlers had already taken up residence in the area, with the result that when John Galt had the first tree cut on what is now the site of Guelph, the area was not completely covered with virgin forest. Right. So as we start to think about our history as a people, in a community, in a city that's established called Guelph, one of the interesting things here is who's missing from this story. Certainly, hopefully, many of us understand now that the land that we find ourselves on is a land that has been held, stewarded, appreciated, used, and supported and nurtured for centuries, millennia even, by other peoples. So when we tell our history and our story, and we say that we turned up into a space and a place where, to our minds, no one was really there, or, in this particular occasion, that there were some people already living there, settlers, it's important for us to acknowledge the indigenous community that had responsibility, had a care for the land that we occupied as settlers. That's the first thing I'd want to say. Now, as a part of our history, the story is told that there was a small group, not a huge group, about 60 Scots, people from Scotland, who'd had quite a journey. If you know the story of some of the founders of Guelph, this group of 60 people had come from Scotland, went to Venezuela in South America to set up a colony as settlers again. A bunch of things happened that didn't work out the way that they were hoping. Eventually found themselves in Canada, in Ontario, and eventually these 57, Stanford Reed mentions, Scots, were gathered, settling in this region. But they had no sort of church affiliation. And he's clear to say that many of them might not have been Church of Scotland, because there was a variety of different flavors of Presbyterianism at that time, in the early 1800s, 1827 to be exact. But this little group were looking for a way of forming a church together and being a community. And it's that little group of Scots that essentially formed who we are today as St. Andrews in Guelph. Now, as you read through this story and this history book, you'll hear a variety of things about how this story went for us. And again, there's some missing pieces, I think, as we tell this story. So we take our history and our founding as a church as 1828. That's why we celebrated our 193rd anniversary. And actually, if you look at our sign, if you're in this local area and look at our sign, we've put a little piece on our sign because our sign says 1832. And then on this little piece of the sign, it says founded 18 1828. And then the building that we're currently in on Norfolk and Suffolk Streets in Guelph, a large stone building, was built in 1857. Whew, history. Some people don't like all the numbers that go into history, but history is all about numbers in some ways. How did we get to this building might be your first question, because if you read the story of the founding of our first church actually resided and was built upon land that was given to us, again, land that came from the indigenous community that the Canada Company and John Galt granted to our church, called Market Square. And again, folks may know Market Square as the place where City Hall in Guelph now resides. That's where our first church was. Now imagine the shock and horror to these Presbyterians who'd been worshiping and being a congregation and worshiping in this building that existed on Market Square. Imagine their horror when they find out that someone has posted a for sale sign on the entirety of Market Square, including, and in the writing, the Scotch Church. Now, just for Scottish people out there in the world and for your own learning and understanding, Scottish people are not Scotch. Scotch is something that you drink that is made in Scotland, but they're not Scotch. They're the Scottish Church or the Scots Church, just so you know. But imagine, like, you're sitting in your pew, and maybe later that day or in the next day you're reading the paper, and there's a for sale sign that says for sale, Market Square, to whoever wants to buy it, that it includes the Scots Church that's there. Now, how did this happen? Well, the way the story's written a little bit, the tidbits that I've heard, and what I read in Stanford Reed's book is, it's possible that John Galt didn't give title to the land to the people who were on the land. There were some businesses there as well, and the Scottish Church, St. Andrew's Presbyterian, was there. We didn't have title to our land. Now, depending on how the legends and how history is spoken about, it could be that we were extremely generous, and we just said, you know what? You want to build a city hall and have it as your municipal centerpiece? Why don't we just move? We may have said that. We may have not. The fact is, this place, the space called Market Square, was bought by the city, and city buildings began to be erected there, and the church was torn down. This meant the church that was there had to move into what at the time was considered sort of the outskirts of town. And if you live in the city of Guelph or you've visited, you'll realize it's not too many blocks away from where the center of town, the Market Square, is. And that's where we reside today, on this corner. Again, on land that was stewarded, cared for by the indigenous community for millennia before we ever turned up. We placed this building that we now reside in on this very spot, on Norfolk and Suffolk Streets. And as a part of a unique feature of our church, it was built in this stone that was common, stone churches, and you'll see a variety of those in Guelph today. We also built a tall spire, and on top of the spire, we had a weather vane that has a rooster. And as for some may know, our rooster became famous a little while back because it got struck by lightning, and parts of the structure burst into flames, and our rooster came tumbling down. We brought him back, and that was great. And again, very quickly, that story relates in the Bible to the story where Jesus says to Peter, you will betray me, deny me 3 times before the rooster crows for the morning. And so we're to look at that and remember that story and connect with that in some way. And that's a feature that is in churches across the globe. We also, an interesting point was, we also had in the original structure of that steeple 8 bells inside it. There were bells. Just so you know, there's no bells there now, and we can't ring the church bells. That's not something we can do. One of the interesting pieces of this story that's told about the building of this building was that a lot of the people were skilled tradespeople who lived in this area, stonemasons and folks like that. So they used their talents to build the church that they have. I think one of the missing pieces when we think about the time and the era that this is, the 1850s, things that were going on in the US, conversations around the Underground Railroad, the formation of communities and churches for the Black community, even in this very city. I wonder if some of the Black community also were a part of the building and the laying the foundation of this very church. It's not spoken about in the history, but it's just curious. The fascinating approach to history, and as somebody who took history, I was a part of the telling of history from the cultural experience, the social and cultural experience of the people at the time. People who did history years before that, they focused more on what they called the great man, and it literally was great men that were, all the stories were told about all the famous people. A little bit of Stanford Reed's history reads a bit about certain individuals, a man named David Allen, who was very much a part of this building happening. The way it's told, this place wouldn't be where it is today without David Allen. I think we have to remind ourselves always that there's some other people who have significant parts to play, and I've already highlighted a couple of those folks that get ignored and maybe forgotten as a part of where we stand today. One of the interesting tidbits that Stanford does include, and his history is written in a way that includes like tangents and tidbits, is that in 1857, this church didn't have a minister, and they were looking for a new minister when the new building was built. And they actually turned down a candidate who there was rumors was in favor of slavery. It's a really interesting point in the cultural history of that day. 1857 in Canada, in Guelph, there was a minister who was being considered as a candidate who was in favor of slavery at the time. It's interesting how some of these things keep coming up, a part of our history, and it's good to know that the church actually turned that candidate down because of their stance on being in favor of slavery at the time. Not to say that there wasn't a whole bunch of other systemic racism and baggage that the denomination, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, or the Church of Scotland at that time, and us throughout our history have continued to hold and still have as a part of things we need to address into the future. But let me just go back to that point of, part of celebrating an anniversary is, hey, we got to 193 years. Look how great we are. Look at what we've done. But we need to remind ourselves always that we didn't do all this on our own. There's that cliched phrase of, behind every great man is a great woman. That's a part of this conversation. But really, we wouldn't have gotten to the place we are today without a lot of folks that we've forgotten and ignored. So as we celebrate our 193rd anniversary, as a congregation, a community that seeks to bring hope and good news and joy and a fullness of life to all that we encounter, as we do that, we need to remember that we wouldn't be where we are without some of those folks that don't get named in the history books, that get ignored as a part of the telling of the stories and the legends that surround it. So today we need to work towards righting that wrong, addressing that systemic problem with how we tell our story. Because our story includes the indigenous community that was here long before us, that essentially we pushed aside. And then the part that we played as a denomination and as a people to severely traumatize and commit in so many ways some heinous violations of that community throughout the years. We own that, and we need to think of ways of addressing that continually around justice and healing. And the forgotten people within the Black community and other persons of color who were a part of our rich and diverse community in Guelph, maybe at the time of the founding of our church and beyond. The parts that those persons played, the roles they had in making this place what it is today. And so that needs to be our commitment, and we feel that is good news worth celebrating on our 193rd anniversary. The service that comes up is from Sunday, April the 25th. It's Good Shepherd Sunday. It's a text from John chapter 10, verses 10 to 18. And I want you to listen carefully to the scripture reading, because in it, Jesus talks about some other sheep. I wonder what that means. I can tell you, it means some more good news. And that's good news to us all.